It's been said that every quilt tells a story, and it's so true. But I also believe every quilter has a story to tell. I wanted to hear about the people behind these wonderful quilts and thought you'd enjoy hearing about their lives also. Welcome to A Quilter's Life. Mary Shepard and I met at QuiltCon 2024 in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is an avid quilter and the president of the Delaware Modern Quilt Guild. Since Mary's retirement from being a mathematician and a computer scientist, she has become an author with her first quilting cozy mystery, Free Motion Murder. Mary, thank you so much for joining us on A Quilter's Life.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I'm happy to be here, Paula.
It was so much fun meeting you at QuiltCon this year.
Yes, it was. I think we were both waiting in line for the same lecture.
I think so. And it was exciting to see, you offer a book. That will be fun to read.
Well, I hope so. And I don't think I've ever met anyone before who does a podcast.
Oh, boy. Let's jump back to where were you born and raised?
So my family moved around quite a bit when I was little. We lived for a while in Seattle, St. Louis, and then when I was in junior high, we moved to West Virginia. And my parents stayed there the rest of their lives. And I went to high school, college there, and moved to the Washington, D.C. area after college.
My ears picked up when you said West Virginia. Now, what part of West Virginia was that?
It's a small town near Charleston. The name of the town is St. Albans.
Okay. I'm just a bit north from there. And then you ended up over in the D.C. area.
Yes, I got a math degree in college. I'd always enjoyed math. And I ended up working for the federal government for most of my career in and around the D.C. metropolitan area in both Maryland and Virginia.
Wow. When you were growing up, do you have a special childhood memory?
Yes, it's from when I was a preschooler and we lived in Seattle. One of my cousins was going to college also in Seattle, and so she stayed with us a lot of weekends. And there was one weekend where it was late. My parents were out. She'd already tucked me and my brother into bed, and it started to snow, which was really rare in Seattle. And so she actually woke us up, got us all bundled up, and we played in the snow late in the night while my parents were out. And she was afraid that my parents were going to be upset with us being up in the middle of the night playing in the snow, but they thought it was fun. And so it ended up all five of us playing in the snow in the middle of the night.
Well, I'm just picturing you all bundled up with that snow coming down. What a wonderful time, just that thought of wonder, because it rarely snows there.
Yes. And my cousin was afraid that it would all have melted by the time we woke up in the morning and that we would have missed it.
And you probably would have.
Probably. And my cousin still lives in the Seattle area.
Oh, have fun. And also, I'm wondering what your parents thought as they drove up and saw you guys playing out there.
Well, she was afraid they were going to be upset with her for not being a very good babysitter, but they thought it was pretty funny. And so they joined us and played in the snow, too.
When I was growing up in Northern California, it snowed, and my mom made some snowmen out in the yard, or some big balls of snow, because she was sure it would melt by the time my siblings and I got out of school. So that's... Now, you got your degree in mathematics. Can you describe your employment?
So the federal government is a large employer of mathematicians. I'll say that there are a lot of government functions, mostly making and breaking codes, and that uses a lot of mathematics. And I was selected to work in that area and did that for most of my career.
Wow. Making and breaking codes. Will you have to kill us if you tell us anymore?
I won't have to kill anyone, but that's about all I can say about that.
It's fun. When you decided in college to go for a mathematics degree, What were you thinking, or how did you make that decision?
Well, I don't think I really was thinking. I'd enjoyed math in high school, and so I just kept taking math classes. And it wasn't until the spring of my senior year that it finally dawned on me that there would need to be a job following this. And so I thought some about teaching, and my advisor at the time signed me up for an aptitude test. I took the test, and the test was so much fun. It tested people's basic ability to solve puzzles, and there was also a section on language proficiency. I was terrible at the language stuff, but I loved the puzzles. And so after the test, I was really intrigued. And so I interviewed with the recruiter from the government when he came to campus, and I just kind of slid into it. So it wasn't a thought out process by any stretch. It was much more of an accident than anything else, but a happy accident.
So you were at the right place at the right time.
I guess so.
You went to college over there, correct?
Yes, I went to West Virginia University in Morgantown.
Oh, okay. And then the job took you to the DC area.
Yes.
Mary, is there anything else about family that you would like to share?
So I'm married. My husband and I don't have any children. We do have 2 cats. I mentioned my brother earlier. He's married and has 2 sons, and I have just fabulous nephews.
And I'm sure you've showered quilts on your nephews.
Yes, I have. They've each had a quilt, and I'm working on one for my sister-in-law now.
Besides quilting, are there other crafts you do or have done in the past?
Well, I started sewing by baking clothes. Once I found patterns harder to fit, I kind of quit doing that. I do some knitting. I used to do counted cross stitch. Knitting feels easy to me, but I've taken 2 classes on crochet, and I just don't get crochet.
That's so interesting. It seems to me that so many people do crochet instead of knitting if they had to choose between the two.
Yes, I know. I have so many friends who say, crochet is easy. Let me just show you, and you'll see how easy it is. Yeah, no, it's not.
I love how we see things so uniquely. How about other hobbies?
I play golf some, and I'm in 2 quilting guilds. The other thing I do that takes a good bit of my time is I'm on the board of directors of a local charity here in Delaware that makes duffel bags and toiletry bags for children who are in foster care. So often those children are moved from house to house and just told to put all their belongings into a trash bag or maybe a pillowcase. So we're trying to just add a little bit of dignity to their lives.
What a wonderful ministry. Thank you for doing that.
And in doing that, I've come across so many wonderful people. It's just a terrific thing to do. I'm enjoying it thoroughly.
Mm-hmm. Do you think any of your hobbies or other crafts show up in your quilting?
No, generally not. I kind of lean more toward modern quilting than traditional. So I'm more looking at geometric things than items that, say, would go with golf or duffel bags or knitting or anything like that. So it's much more abstract.
Interesting. I'm excited to see your quilts. Who introduced you to quilting?
Indirectly, my mother did. My mother was not a quilter, but she had a couple of quilts that her mother had made. And I have those quilts now, but that grandmother died right around the time I was born. So it was a grandparent that I never knew. But I have her quilts. And even as a child, I was just fascinated by how all these little pieces of fabric could be sewn together, because most of the ones that my grandmother did are hexes. And so I couldn't figure out how those went together at all.
When those hexes were put together, did she quilt that or did she tie it?
She quilted it. It's all about 1/4 of an inch from the seam.
Oh, cool.
They're beautiful. They're soft pastel and they're baby quilt sizes.
Do you think the hexies were made out of remnants of material or old clothing, or did she buy the material to put it together?
They look to me like she bought the fabric. We had one quilt of hers when I was growing up, which was just leftover scraps of fabrics. And it was just a dozen 4-inch squares, one direction, and so many a different direction. That one was always the throw that we had for when we were watching television, and it eventually disintegrated. So I don't have that one anymore, but it had corduroy and denim and wool you'd use to make a skirt. It had all kinds of fabrics in it.
Oh, boy. But it sounds like it was well loved.
It was loved to death.
Whether it's a quilt that you made or that someone else made, do you have a favorite one?
Yes, I do. I have one that I made in a class with Carol Lyles Shaw. It's one where you do some piecing and then you cut your pieces apart and reassemble them. So that's one that I'll send you a photograph of. I call it Mid-Century Energy.
It sounds interesting. I can't wait to see it.
And every time I look at it, I think, oh, I've learned so much since I did that one, but it's still my favorite.
And it sounds like you learned a lot doing that one, too.
Yes. And Carol Lyles Shaw is a terrific teacher. She's one of my favorite of the famous quilters.
Did you have to go far for that class, or was it local?
It was during the pandemic, and so it was all on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
One of my guilds brought her in as a guest lecturer.
Nice. And we have so many tools to choose from anymore. Do you happen to have one that you are so happy you have?
Yes, it's a stiletto. It makes tricky piecing go so much easier. And every time I pull it out and use it, I start thinking of the Queen song, and I'm thinking I see a little stiletto of a man. And so that starts going through my head every time I use my stiletto.
What's your favorite part of the quilting process?
It's definitely piecing. I just love the time I'm sewing pieces of fabric together at the sewing machine. One of my guilds does baby quilts for charity, and the group that runs that makes up kits. So all I have to do is pick up a kit, I sew it together, I sandwich it, and I can either tie it or practice some free motion and bind it. But it saves me all of the cutting and measuring and all that sort of stuff. So it's a great project for me.
And does that kind of transfer onto your personal quilts? Do you prefer to use a pattern, or do you make up your own?
I mostly do my own designs. I use EQ8 for some of that and just paper and pencil for a lot of it. Most of the quilts that I design are essentially one block in the whole quilt, although a few times recently now I've been doing the same block but made in slightly different ways and put together in different ways. But no, it's been a while since I've used someone else's pattern.
Yeah. Share your worst quilting experience.
It almost made me quit quilting. So it was the first time I was going to do any sort of quilting that wasn't just stitch in the ditch. So I was still doing a pattern, but it was a modern pattern, and I pinned it all together, and I started doing the quilting as they described, which was a mix of edge to edge and go sort of into the middle and then come back some. And the backing and the batting and the quilt top were scooting all around. I had big tucks, I had gathers. It was a terrible mess. And instead of just stopping, I kept going. And so I ended up with this quilt top that was just a complete mess. And so I decided that I really liked the top. I wanted to finish it and have it be something I was proud of. So for 2 months in a row, I went to my guild's pre-meeting sew-in time, and all I did was pick out the stitches that I had put into this quilt. Thankfully, it was just a wall hanging size, but my friends in that guild call me the seam ripper queen. But I did get the whole thing ripped out. And before I started quilting it again, someone told me about Jackie Gehring's book, Walk. I will say that book changed my quilting life. So I was able to get the quilt basted well so that it was secure. I was using a little bit better batting, and I was able to quilt that in a way that I ended up being very proud of.
And I made an assumption you were quilting it on a domestic machine?
Yes, I was doing that on a domestic machine, and probably at the time I was doing that, I hadn't even heard of a long arm, or if I did, I didn't know what a long arm was.
Well, congratulations for getting that done on a domestic machine. That sounds difficult.
Well, it was wall hanging size, which is the only thing that makes it feasible. But it was a terrific learning experience, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, we have the same amount of time. So why do you think you continue to quilt rather than do anything else that you could do?
One, there's so much camaraderie and community with my quilting guilds. I just love so many of the people that I've met through that. It's really a great way to make new friends, and it's a creative expression, a creative outlet for me. And I've always loved to sew, and making clothes just doesn't have the appeal that it once did. So that's kind of it, creative expression and a sense of community with my friends.
Yeah. Then who do you make your quilts for?
Well, we already mentioned I've made one for each of my nephews, and I'm working on one for my sister-in-law. I have a friend from high school, farther back than that, actually from junior high. She helped me edit my book, and she's a very spiritual person. And I came across a quilt pattern that looked like a stained glass window. I made one of those for her. That's about the only one that I've made for friends, other than the occasional table runner or something like that. Mostly I make them to hang on the walls.
You mentioned the stained glass window. Was that difficult to make?
No, it was not. It was an Eleanor Burns pattern. I found it when I was going through a bunch of my traditional patterns, seeing which pattern books I could get rid of. And I came across one of her patterns with batik fabrics and black that looked like a stained glass window. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, oh, this would be perfect for Peg. And so I made that one for her.
Well, the ones I've seen are so beautiful, so I was curious if they were difficult.
Well, this was pretty simple. It was half square triangles and rectangles.
Oh, cool. Are you working on a special quilting project right now?
One of my guilds had a retreat back in January, and a friend of mine was working on a quilt using jelly rolls by Beth Ann Nemish. What she was doing looked so fun and looked so good as she was assembling it that I decided I needed to make one of those too. So I've got the quilt top put together, and I had it on my design wall for 3 or 4 weeks, and I could not figure out how to quilt it. It's got more of a pattern in it than just a standard color gradation. And so I wanted to feature that a little bit. So I took it to my guild meeting last Sunday and showed it at show and tell and said, okay, you've seen this before, but I just want your ideas on how to quilt this. I got so many good ideas. And again, there's that sense of community.
How helpful for you and how fun for them.
It was. It's a great bunch of people.
I bet they're looking forward to seeing what you do with it too.
And again, it's going to be domestic quilting. So I got to get the basting really down and go slow. That's my big thing is I've got to go slow for domestic quilting.
Mm-hmm. Share a quilting tip.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the book Walk by Jackie Gehring is just fantastic. I've actually bought 3 copies of the book because I've ended up loaning it to people, and they've said, "Oh, I love this book so much. Can I keep it?" So I'm on my 3rd copy of it, and I've also bought Walk 2. But her explanation of how you get a good sandwich and how you get a good stitch is like nothing else I've ever seen.
I'm sure we're going to want to go look that up now. Well, as we talked at QuiltCon, I found out that you had written a book.
Yes, that's right.
And so, of course, I went out and I bought your book, and
Oh, thank you.
this was so much fun.
My book is called Free Motion Murder. It's set here in Delaware. Our hero is Liz Murphy. As a full-time job, she teaches math at the local high school. She and her sister own a quilt shop, and the fictional quilt shop is, of course, the biggest and best quilt shop on the East Coast. She takes her math students to a math competition at a local college where she meets a handsome math professor. And one of the other teachers dies suddenly while they're at the competition. So, as it turns out, both Liz, her niece, and the handsome math professor are all suspects in apparently a suspicious murder. And so Liz gets worried about this. She certainly doesn't want to go to prison for a murder she didn't commit. And she's even more concerned about her niece. So she decides that she and her friends are going to figure out who really did it. And they do. So in between tracking down the murderer and getting into some really ridiculous situations, there's a lot of quilting going on too.
Well, a couple of things I love so far, I'm only about halfway through it, is there's a twist that I was, oh, and I just love that because it made my mind switch around and it's making me think. So I love that. And also, I love the size of your chapters because with being so busy, I can sit down and read a chapter because they're a little bit shorter, and I really like that about it.
I took a writing class and I followed that instructor's suggestions on chapter length. I do know that they're a little bit shorter, but the book is light. It's not a heavy police procedural type of mystery. It's in the genre called cozy mysteries. And so it's lighthearted and it's meant to be a little lighter. So I did keep the chapters a little bit shorter.
Well, I appreciate that.
I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Can you describe the process you went through to begin writing this book?
So I always loved mysteries, even when I was in grade school. I read Harriet the Spy, Encyclopedia Brown, and of course, Nancy Drew. And as an adult, I loved mysteries as well. I started noticing that a lot of mysteries were fairly similar in their structure. So I had this terrible thought of, well, there's so much in common from one mystery to another. How hard could it be to write one myself? And the answer is it's much harder than I thought it was going to be. So I tried writing the book and then dropped back and took several classes. I took a community college class right before the pandemic started, and then I took some more online. And those made a huge difference. So essentially, I look at a structure that's common for most mysteries, and I decide what's going to be in the plot at those different points. What are the scary scenes, and how is it going to be resolved? And the harder thing for me was developing characters. What are these people really like? How do they talk? And so that was something that I really had to spend a lot of time with. And so I'm working on a sequel. And a lot of people have said, oh, is it going to be the same characters? And my answer is, oh, yes, it's going to be the same characters because I worked so hard to create this cast of characters. I don't want to create any more new characters if I don't have to, because that's the hardest part for me.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm glad to hear another book's coming out.
It's going to be called The Long Arm of the Law. And it's when a famous quilter comes to town to teach a 4-day-long seminar at Mariner's Compass Quilt Shop. She comes into town and she brings her entourage of husband, sister, her executive assistant, her daughter, and all I'm going to say is that shortly after she comes to town, bad things begin to happen.
Well, thanks for not giving that away. Well, I'm curious, with the quilt shop in your book being the Mariner's Compass, have you made a Mariner's Compass quilt?
Yes, I've made a very small Mariner's Compass, and it's the quilt shown on the cover of my book. I did that with the Robin Ruth design approach, where you do it by strip piecing instead of paper piecing. All through the class, the instructor kept saying, oh, this is just your first one. Don't worry if you get anything wrong. And I made sure I got everything as good as I could because I don't want to have to do that again. That's one of the most difficult quilting projects I've ever taken on.
Interesting.
All those points.
Well, it's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
After you had the book written and you were ready to sell it, when you first sold it to somebody that wasn't a friend or a relative, how exciting was that?
Oh, it was incredible. I had tried for a while to get an agent or a traditional publisher and finally decided to self-publish. And one of my local quilt guilds was having their semi-annual show, and that was about a year ago. And so I made sure that I had a bunch printed before the show, and I had a booth there, and my guild mates and the other people who came to the show were just fantastic. And I still remember the lady that I sold the first one to, but I managed to sell 101 books at that quilt show. And I haven't looked back from then, but I'm just incredibly grateful to the other members of Ocean Waves Quilt Guild here in Lewis.
Quilters are so uplifting, aren't they? I love how they reach out to each other.
Yes. And this is an area where a lot of people have retired and a lot of people wrote books during the pandemic. And so being a local author is nothing special here to the local bookshops. We're a dime a dozen to the local bookshops. But to a quilt guild, I'm kind of a novelty. So I've found that my best audience and my best marketing audience are fellow quilters.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned that you took that test and you did so well on math, you mentioned that you were terrible in language. So that surprised me, knowing that you had written a book. I assumed that you've gotten a lot better over the years.
That particular language test was aptitude for foreign languages.
Oh, okay.
So how quickly can you start learning a language and become proficient in it? And unfortunately, the answer for me is almost forever. It takes me an incredibly long time to even learn basic vocabulary in another language. So my employer was not inclined to put me in a language training program.
That makes a lot more sense. Mary, is there anything else that you wanted to share about your book?
Part of the fun of writing it was that I included a number of real-life places here in Lewis and mixed those in with fictional places. The high school where Liz teaches is fictional, but a couple of the restaurants that she and her friends go to as they work on who might have done this murder are actually real. And so I ask all the managers at those local places, because they're places I go to and enjoy going to. And the managers all said, of course you can put us in your book. Just make sure that you don't have the murder happen here or anything really bad happen here. As long as it's happy, you can include it in your book.
Yes, so far what I've read, that restaurants are wonderful places for your characters.
I love to eat out, and my characters do too.
And where can we find Free Motion Murder?
You can buy Free Motion Murder either as an ebook or as a paperback from Amazon. If you want an autographed copy, you can purchase one at my website, which is mariners-compass-murders.square.site. And if you order it from there, I'll autograph it and then ship it to you.
Great. And that link will be on your episode page also.
Oh, good. Well, Paula, thank you so much for having me on. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Well, thanks, Mary. I was so glad that you were able to join me today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You can find more stories on aquilterslife.com or subscribe on your favorite podcast player so each episode will be downloaded automatically. Also, I want to hear about you and your wonderful quilts. Please contact me, Paula Chamberlain, through the website to set up an interview. And as always, thanks for listening.